In the 1960s, the United States had some truly bizarre laws that could make you raise an eyebrow or two. Imagine not being allowed to drive without shoes or facing fines for wearing a fake mustache that makes people laugh in church. And forget about whistling underwater, that was strictly forbidden. These quirky rules left everyone puzzled. So join us as we explore 20 weird things in the 60s that were illegal. In California back in the 60s, it was illegal to ride a bicycle in a swimming pool. This unusual law was likely put in place for public safety reasons, aiming to prevent accidents and injuries in recreational areas. The rationale behind such a law might have been straightforward. Mixing bicycles and swimming pools could lead to accidents both for the rider and other pool users. The slippery surfaces, combined with the weight and speed of the bike, could create a dangerous environment. This law stayed on the books until it was eventually deemed unnecessary and was abolished in the late 20th century as public safety regulations evolved and enforcement priorities shifted. As bizarre as the swimming pool bicycle ban was, could you believe there were even stranger laws in the 60s? Back in the 1960s, life in Boston, Massachusetts was a bit wilder than today. You couldn't just stroll down the street with your pet lion, tiger, or leopard on a leash. Well, that made sense in a big way. Big cats aren't your typical furry companions, and city streets aren't exactly the savannah.
Michael, she calls him, and he just loves his walk in the park. The canines aren't really sure if he's one of them or not.
So the lawmakers put their foot down. This rule had been around for a while, a relic from more cautious times. People were worried about safety, and rightly so. Can you imagine the headlines if a lion got loose in downtown Boston? Thankfully, as times changed and laws evolved, this quirky restriction faded away. People started realizing that walking a lion around wasn't the best idea for both the animal and everyone else. So, sometime later, this law quietly disappeared into history books. In the 1960s, Alabama had a rule that banned playing dominoes on Sundays. The law wasn't just some random whim, it had a purpose. Sundays were seen as a day of rest and reverence, a time for reflection in church. Playing dominoes might have seemed too worldly or distracting from the solemnity of the day. This prohibition had been around for quite some time, a leftover from a more conservative era when communities upheld strict moral codes. People respected these rules, even if they seemed a bit quirky to outsiders. However, as times changed and attitudes toward leisure evolved, so did the laws. Eventually, Alabama decided the dominoes weren't the devil's game after all, and the ban was lifted. It quietly faded away. But if you think a ban on playing dominoes on Sunday was odd, wait till you hear about this next quirky prohibition. You'd think cruising in your Volkswagen Beetle barefooted was as normal as grooving to the Beatles, right? Well, not in Alabama. Back in the 60s, the law said you had to have something on your feet while behind the wheel. Why? Safety first, they said. They figured shoes provided better control over those classic cars.
Turn right, and then turn right.
So, imagine you're out for a Sunday drive, feeling the breeze in your hair, the pedals under your toes, except nope, not your toes because you gotta have some flip-flops or loafers on. This rule wasn't just a joke. It was the real deal until they loosened up on it over time. Fast forward to today, and you can now pedal around Alabama barefoot if that's your thing. Laws change with the times, right? Back in the 60s, Pennsylvania had this quirky law that made it illegal to catch some Z's inside a refrigerator. Yep, you heard that right. You couldn't just crawl into your family's old fridge after a long day of peace protest or moonwalking. Why? Well, it was all about safety. See, those old refrigerators could lock from the inside, and kids being kids, they'd sometimes hop in for a hide-and-seek or a quick nap. The trouble was, if the door was shut, it could get pretty dicey in there. So the state decided to cool it with that kind of risky business. They passed a law to keep folks safe and sound, making it clear that fridges were for keeping your Jell-O salads cool, not your cool cats cozy. Over time, as appliances got safer and kids got smarter about not climbing into old cubby holes, the law faded away like last season's bell bottoms. Today, you could snooze where you please without worrying about breaking the ice with the fridge police. While sleeping in a refrigerator ban might surprise you, what other bizarre illegalities lurked in the 1960s? Back in the 60s, Arizona had a rule that said you couldn't feed garbage to your pigs, well, unless you had the government's approval. They were dead serious about what pigs could munch on. This law came into play to prevent the spread of diseases that could potentially wreak havoc on livestock and, indirectly, on people too. It was all about keeping things clean and healthy. So, why the fuss over pig diets? Well, back then, diseases like foot and mouth could devastate entire farms if not kept in check. By regulating what pigs ate, authorities hoped to nip any potential outbreaks in the bud. Fast forward to when this oddball law got tossed out. It was in the 80s when Arizona decided it wasn't practical or necessary anymore. By then, farming practices and waste disposal had evolved, making the law more of a relic than a necessity. Back in Alabama during the 1960s, there was this bizarre law that made it illegal to stroll around with an ice cream cone in your back pocket. Now, you might wonder why such a law existed on Earth. Well, believe it or not, it was actually meant to prevent horse theft. Here's the quirky reasoning behind it. Sneaky horse thieves would apparently lure horses away by dangling delicious treats like ice cream cones in their back pockets. Picture this: someone walking with an ice cream cone peeking out of their back pocket, tempting horses to follow them like a trail of crumbs. Now, this law wasn't just a random burst of legislative creativity. Back in the day, horses were not just pets. They were essential for transportation and work on farms. Losing a horse to theft could mean serious trouble for its owner, so lawmakers were dead set on protecting these valuable animals. Thankfully, this peculiar law didn't stick around forever. It was eventually abolished. Just when you thought the no ice cream cones in your back pocket ban was the strangest law, there's another 1960s prohibition that will surprise you. Back in the 1960s in West Virginia, there was a law that made it illegal to whistle underwater. The idea behind this law was probably to prevent underwater whistlers from disturbing the peace or maybe scaring the fish away. Imagine that! This law dates back to who knows when, but it was likely one of those old-timey rules that stuck around longer than it should have. It's hard to say exactly what lawmakers felt the need to crack down on underwater whistling, but it probably seemed like a good idea at the time. Thankfully, laws like this eventually saw their end. As society evolved and priorities shifted, many of these outdated regulations were abolished. Back in Alabama during the 1960s, there was a law that banned wearing fake mustaches that caused laughter in church. Fake mustaches were serious business when it came to church services. The idea behind this law was to maintain the solemnity and reverence of religious gatherings, ensuring that everyone could focus on worship without distractions. This law reflected the values of the time, where decorum and respect for religious ceremonies were highly prioritized. Imagine someone walking into church with a comically large fake mustache, causing a wave of giggles among the congregation. It might have been seen as disrespectful or disruptive. Like many unusual laws from that era, this one eventually faded away as societal norms evolved. As people's attitudes towards religious practices and personal expression changed, laws like these were either repealed or simply fell out of enforcement. As bizarre as the fake mustache and church ban was, could there be something even weirder? Arizona had a peculiar law back in the 60s that made it illegal to hunt camels. Yep, camels, even though Arizona isn't exactly known for its wild camel population. The reasoning behind this law remains a bit of a mystery. Perhaps lawmakers wanted to prevent any future influx of camels or ensure protection for any exotic animals that might wander into the state. This law likely dates back to an era when legislative bodies were concerned with protecting wildlife, even if that wildlife was more common in other parts of the world. It's one of those quirky regulations that make you wonder about the stories behind its creation. As with many outdated laws, this one eventually fell by the wayside as priorities shifted and legal codes were updated. Today, you won't find any camels roaming the Arizona desert, and if you do, Rest assured that hunting them is no longer a concern. Well, legally at least. Back in the 1960s, Atlanta, Georgia had a rather peculiar law on the books. It was illegal to tie a giraffe to a telephone pole or street lamp. Someone, somewhere, once thought it necessary to outlaw hitching a giraffe to public fixtures specifically. The reasoning behind this law remains a bit of a mystery. Still, one can imagine it was aimed at keeping the city streets clear of unusual obstructions or perhaps a precaution against public disturbances caused by roaming giraffes. As for when this law was passed, the exact date is lost to history's whimsy. Fortunately, like many quirky laws of the past, it was eventually abolished. Today, Atlanta is free from the specter of giraffes tethered to its infrastructure. Think you've heard it all when it comes to quirky laws? Here's another regulation that kept folks on their toes during the 60s. In Idaho during the 1960s, another oddly specific law captured attention. It was illegal to fish while riding on the back of a giraffe. Yep, you heard that right. Giraffe fishing was a no-go. This law had folks scratching their heads and wondering, why giraffes? Well, it turns out that it wasn't really about the giraffes themselves. It was more about safety concerns and maybe a touch of common sense. The law dates back to a time when Idaho lawmakers were probably trying to prevent any wild antics that could lead to accidents or just plain old silliness. Imagine someone trying to reel in a trout while perched atop a giraffe's neck. Talk about a balancing act. This quirky law was eventually tossed into the history books as times changed and priorities shifted. Laws like these fell out of favor, and folks were free once again to fish without worrying about their giraffe riding habits, landing them in hot water with the law. Back in the 1960s, Iowa had a rule that put a cap on kisses. You couldn't lock lips for more than 5 minutes in public. Imagine that, being told to keep your smooches short and sweet. This law was a product of its time when public displays of affection were seen as a bit too hot to handle for some folks. Passed to maintain decency and uphold proper conduct, it reflected a more conservative era's values. Authorities likely aimed to prevent overly amorous displays that could raise eyebrows or offend sensibilities. It was a time when societal norms were shifting, and what was considered appropriate behavior was under scrutiny. Thankfully, this limit on lip locks didn't last forever. As societal attitudes toward public displays of affection relaxed over the decades, laws like these were eventually seen as outdated. People realized that love, like a good Beatles tune, shouldn't be restricted by a stopwatch. Just when you think the no kissing for more than 5 minutes law was the peak of weirdness, what else did the 1960s prohibit? Back in North Carolina during the swingin' 60s, there was a rather peculiar law on the books. No using elephants to plow cotton fields. Now, you might be thinking, elephants in a cotton field? What were they thinking? Well, this law actually had a bit of history behind it. Back in the day, some farmers thought using elephants could be a clever way to plow their fields. Elephants are strong and mighty creatures after all. But lawmakers weren't so keen on the idea. They were concerned about the practicality and safety of using such large animals for farming, not to mention the potential damage elephants could cause to the crops themselves. So in North Carolina, they put their foot down and made it illegal to harness elephants for agricultural work. It was a quirky regulation aimed at keeping farming practices safe and practical, even if it meant saying no to a potentially wild and woolly idea. As times changed and farming methods evolved, this law eventually faded away. Farmers found more efficient ways to plow their fields, and elephants stuck to their natural habitats rather than the cotton fields of North Carolina. Back in the 1960s, North Carolina had a law that could have made karaoke night a bit risky. It was illegal to sing off-key in public. Imagine hitting a sour note and suddenly finding yourself on the wrong side of the law. This quirky rule wasn't just about musical preferences, it was a genuine law, passed likely to maintain peace and harmony in public spaces. Imagine you're belting out your favorite tune, feeling the groove, when suddenly someone taps you on the shoulder and asks if you have a permit for that voice. Well, okay, maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but singing off-key could technically land you in some serious legal trouble. Thankfully, as time marched on and society loosened up a bit, this law hit the high notes of absurdity and was eventually abolished. By the end of the 60s, folks in North Carolina could sing their hearts out without worrying about being off pitch. If you think singing off key band was odd, wait until you hear about this next quirky 1960s prohibition. In 1960s Arizona, it was illegal to keep a donkey in a bathtub. Yep, you heard that right. Bathtub donkeys were a definite no-no. This quirky law was all about preventing, well, donkey-related bathroom mishaps and perhaps avoiding a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy. Passed at a time when urban planning was evolving and folks were moving to cities, the law aimed to maintain public health and safety. Now picture this, a homeowner deciding to house their donkey in the bathroom, maybe to keep it warm or just for kicks. But alas, lawmakers were quick to put a stop to such antics. They wanted to ensure that bathtubs remained reserved for good, clean human use, not as makeshift stables. Thankfully, this law didn't linger forever. As the 60s turned into the 70s and beyond, Arizona's legal focus shifted to more pressing matters. The bathtub donkey law faded away into the annals of history. In 1960 San Francisco, it was not allowed to indulge in a juicy slice of watermelon during a picnic in the park. This peculiar law had folks wondering why something as refreshing as watermelon was banned in public spaces. The law was rooted in concerns about cleanliness and potential messes. Imagine parks crowded with families and friends, and suddenly, watermelon seeds are everywhere. It was a measure to keep public spaces tidy and maybe avoid any sticky situations. Literally. Imagine trying to enjoy a sunny day out only to end up with watermelon juice on your picnic blanket. Thankfully, as times changed and attitudes towards outdoor dining relaxed, this quirky law eventually got the boot. People could once again savor their watermelon without worrying about breaking the law. While it's hard to believe eating watermelon in the park was prohibited, what other odd laws existed in that decade? Did you know that back in the 1960s, South Carolina had this wacky rule that kids under 18 couldn't play pinball? That's right, there will be no flipping those machines unless you're of legal age. This law sparked some head-scratching moments and probably a few rebellious nudges from younger players itching to rack up points. The law was originally passed with good intentions, aiming to curb gambling-like behaviors often associated with pinball machines. Back then, some folks worried that pinball could lead to delinquency or even addiction among minors. So to keep the peace and protect the youth from what was seen as a gateway to trouble, lawmakers laid down the rule. But as time spun forward, attitudes toward pinball shifted. It became clear that these machines were more about skill and fun than anything sinister. So the law eventually lost its bounce. In 1960s New York City, you might have been stopped in your tracks by a peculiar law: no carrying a plank of wood on the sidewalk. The rationale behind this odd regulation was very straightforward: safety. With the city's bustling streets and crowded sidewalks, the thought of someone lugging a long, unwieldy plank through the throngs was a recipe for accidents and chaos. Imagine navigating a busy sidewalk with a large plank in tow. People would have had to swerve, dodge, and possibly tumble over, creating a hazard for pedestrians. The law was designed to prevent such mishaps, ensuring that the sidewalks remain safe and unobstructed for everyone. Over time, as the city's regulations evolved and safety concerns shifted focus, this law eventually faded into obscurity. Today, New Yorkers can carry their wood planks with impunity, no longer worrying about a fine for their lumber-laden strolls. If the ban on carrying a plank of wood on the sidewalk surprised you, wait until you hear about this next bizarre law. Back in the 1960s, Portland, Oregon had a curious law on the books: no roller skating in the bathroom. You heard that correctly, roller skating in bathrooms was prohibited. The reasoning behind this rule was all about safety. Imagine trying to navigate slick bathroom floors on wheels. Talk about a recipe for slips and falls. This law likely came about to prevent accidents and keep bathrooms safe for everyone. It might sound a bit odd today, but back then, bathroom safety was taken seriously, even if it meant outlawing some unconventional activities. As times changed and bathroom designs evolved, this law eventually faded away. People started focusing on more pressing issues, and roller skating in bathrooms became less of a concern for lawmakers.